All right. Well, kia ora, friends. Welcome to a big night on Word Made Flesh. And I wonder whether actually, does someone want to just open? Kath, do you want to pray for us just as we begin?
I'd love to. Gracious God, we thank you for gathering us in this way. I pray that, Holy Spirit, you would enable us to hear what you want us to hear tonight, Jesus. I pray that our minds, if they're whirring with stuff going on, that you would, in that beautiful way that you do, just calm our thoughts so that we can be so present to what you are wanting us to hear. I pray that you would bless all of our conversations and just create how you do always, a really beautiful sacred space, even in this weird kind of way of gathering online. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so I thought, given that there's a lot of us, I didn't think we'd go around the whole group and hear everybody report in on their Kairos moments, but I did wonder whether there was anyone who felt like there's been a something, so they were sent out, I don't know, a week ago, but whether there's been something that's been particularly helpful or interesting or a bit feeling God momentish within the acting on your Kairos. I just thought we'd check in first. Just in case there's a good story.
I'll fill the silence. I'll go first. This one is kudos to Lizzie for scheduling a dinner with a friend of ours this evening, only a few hours ago. But I felt like God was making the words second chance stick out to me in our last session, and for me, just that sense of second chance people that deserve deserve dignity to be seen the way that Jesus sees them. And we have a friend in the neighbourhood who's definitely a second chance person. He's often sitting around in Miramar, just hanging out and seeking some koha from people. And he's been a lovely member of our Strathmore Community Church community for a long time as well. Often quite a surprisingly prophetic guy with some amazing words and prayers. And anyway, it was his birthday today, and we had him over for dinner for a mac and cheese. And it was just a really special time having him here at our whare for our boys. And he commented on how he felt like the Holy Spirit was really present in our house. So just a really lovely time together. And thank you, Lizzie, for booking the for this evening.
I can go as well.
Oh, yeah.
So when you emailed them out, Alison, mine was just to connect with a woman and ask if she wanted to pray, someone who maybe could join our kind of teaming space next year. And we were meant to pray on Monday, but she had to go to a funeral, so we're praying next week. But she was just so keen. She was like, yes, I would love to pray, you know? So I think sometimes I'm like, oh, do they want to? Do they not want to? But she was really like, yes, that would be great. But it's just a good reminder for me that, yeah, I don't know, God's working, and she really wanted to pray.
So good. Anyone else got something they'd like to share?
I'm actually sharing on behalf of Gabby, but it's connected to our crew. She's not quite here yet. She's coming now. I can see her. We're at Play Centre on Tuesdays, and today one of the mums came up to Gabby and sat along beside her and told her quite a sad part of that her mum had been diagnosed with cancer, but asked us if we would pray for her when we gather together, which is really cool that we're known as people of prayer. So I'm sharing your God moment, Gabby.
Yeah, so good.
Yeah, it's just really encouraging because, you know, that's one of the things that we want to be known for as people who know Jesus and actually really care about that. So it's encouraging because they are not people who go to church, but her mum is, and so she came to us specifically to ask as people to be kind of that connection. Yeah, it's cool.
That's good. Lots of good. So it just shows these Kairos moments. They're not a waste of time. They're good. Anyone else? I just had a bit of an encouragement. Mine was follow-up conversations. I can't even remember who I was meant to be following up on, but I have felt really stirred up just around if we're planting churches and we're wanting to see those churches grow, we kind of do need to be good at sharing our faith and talking to people and inviting them along, because we're not just wanting already Christian people to be joining us, we're wanting new to faith people. And one of the people that I've been thinking about is the senior clinical psychologist at Rimutaka Prison, and I've known her for years. And, you know, she plays a little bit hard to get, but I have said, hey, look, it'd be really good for us just to have coffee. And she'd raised some stuff. And so anyway, we had a chat and she has asked me to come to church. We had a real faith talk. She wanted to know about how I deal with shame, and we talked about psychology versus faith, and now she wants to come to St. David's. So that is quite exciting. So I think the moral of my story is I need to just be keeping on those conversations and chatting with people. But yeah, it's good. All right, shall we move on then? Yep. Cool. I just, so tonight we're talking about incarnation, word made flesh. And I guess I do want to preface this with, you know, there's a little teaching input piece, but I don't feel like, you know, what I'm doing is giving you a whole lot of new facts that it's kind of like, wow, I have never ever thought of that before. But what we're trying to do is just, I feel like tonight is about raising some issues, reminding us of some issues, and then to stimulate some thinking about our contexts. And it was actually good for me because even in the preparation of this, I felt like God just, you know, took me on a bit of a journey of reminding me of things that I know well and thinking about our journey and thinking about where to from here. So yeah, the point of tonight is just to stimulate some thinking, not necessarily come up with a whole lot that is brand new. So we will begin with our biblical reflection, and there's just a couple of scriptures there. John 1:14, an oldie but a goodie. So the word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we've seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. That's probably a fairly predictable scripture to be using if we're talking about incarnation. And I know that, what's his name?
Jesus.
No, the man that wrote the message.
Spirit.
The guy that wrote the message.
Eugene Peterson. The message version is quite cool.
But you know, his translation is something about, you know, he moved into the neighbourhood, which I think is a really nice translation. A less quoted scripture with regards to incarnation is on your sheet, Exodus 2:11-14. And does someone just want to, Marty, you're next to me. Do you want to read it for us? Just here.
Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid, thinking, "Everyone knows what I did."
So there we go. There's a nice little cameo of not great missional practice and not quite incarnating appropriately to your context. So we've got Moses coming in under the assumption that he knows what the Hebrews need. And as I was doing a little bit of reading around that, you know, he'd been raised by Egyptians and he walked and talked like an Egyptian, but made an assumption that he knew what they needed. And so we're going to try and unpack that a bit today and just think about, yeah, how do we ensure that we don't go into a neighbourhood and operate on these assumptions around what our neighbourhood needs, and even in that process of being very well-meaning, actually alienating the people or distancing the people that we are there to reach. So we've got a couple of slides, and I'm going to do a whiz through just a few good stories of incarnation. And this first one, I'm assuming you will know, so I won't spend a long time on it. But most of us know about good old Father Damien, originally from Belgium, but went to Molokai in Hawaii. And so born in 1840, died in 1889, and had a call to the poor. And he used to go in his boat to the leper colony, and he'd drop things off at people's doors, and then he'd come back at the end of each day. But then after a while, he felt called to go and actually make his home there. And of course, as we know the story goes, he contracted leprosy. And in fact, when he became ill, he was offered to return to Europe, where there was a cure, and to receive treatment for the cure. And he decided to stay on the basis that none of the other lepers had that choice. And so he died at 49. So, yeah, an extreme example of real compassion, where it means suffering alongside. And there's a quote that says, "Pity weeps and walks away, compassion comes to help and stay." So that's the first one. But what you may not know, if we can have the next slide, Marty, is a beautiful example on our own whenua. And this is one I only discovered probably about a year ago, but this Hare Maihi Ruarangi. So lesser known story. I read about this in David Moxon's book. Don't know if any of you have read it. Nō reira nei te awhina mōku. Where does my help come from? So in the photo, if you look down the front, there's a little child on the bottom right, and the next one next to him, that is our friend Hare. And that's the only photo that it seems that is on record of him. So born 1889 and then passed away 1913. He was Ngāti Whātua and Ngāti Paoa. And he was ordained and was regarded as really well educated. So he was a bit of a up and coming, little star, I guess, amongst the educated Māori clergy. Lived in Thames and would travel on horseback huge distances as far north as Whangarei, which is quite away from Thames, across to the Coromandel Peninsula, down to Paeroa, and he attended to 40 different settlements, places where there were not churches and where there was no vicar. So beautiful example of just this committed ministry where he'd do this on horseback, and was clearly incredibly pastoral and constantly going to those distant places. And baptized many people, and then in the middle of all that lost his wife in 1901, and then was transferred to Hopu Hopu in the Waikato, which is not far from Ngaroa Wahia, to be a priest, and that was in 1903, so just a couple of years after his wife had died. And where he was sent in Hopu Hopu had very complex land history from an Anglican perspective. We won't go into that big story now, but it is quite an interesting read. So he was faithful to the mission of his church. He had 20 people from all over the Waikato area come for confirmation a few years after he'd arrived in that parish. So he was hugely effective, greatly loved, ministry grew, and he ended up with 16 different ministry sites that he was pastoring. Big advocate for Māori education, and championed those who graduated to go back to their settlements. So it wasn't popular once people were educated to go back to the poor settlements. I guess it was more the kind of go to the big cities and be on the rise. And he wanted people just to go back to the grassroots of where they were from. He was very supportive of women's education ahead of his time, and supported had a very holistic ministry, education, healthcare training, and very strong social justice bent. And then in 1913, there was a smallpox epidemic in Aotearoa, and funnily enough, vaccination had dropped, particularly for Māori, so it really hit Māori hard. And then Hopu Hopu, where Hare was living, became a quarantine centre. And people were sent there, and it was terrible because they were sent there and then they weren't allowed to leave. So once you were in, and you couldn't go. And so they couldn't be with their whānau. And so Hari was so devoted to his Māori parishioners, believing that as a sacrament bearer and a priest, he felt moved to respond by offering pastoral care to people who he knew had contracted smallpox. And so he actively nursed parishioners, sometimes in his own home, and then, of course, contracted the disease and suffered hugely as it spread through his body. And he was known to have prayed constantly during his period of agony, and then he died at 41. There is a beautiful, more recent story. I just think it's nice, even though this is not quite the incarnation, but I think it's the fruit of that on the original site of his church, in 1985, I think it was, from memory, there's a new chapel of Māori design that was built. And so when there was the return of land to Tainui Iwi, this church was built, and now there are regular karakia and ecumenical services held there to this day. And I think that is quite beautiful, that there is the fruit of continued ministry there, even after some pretty rugged history. I want to be really quick, but just we'll do the next slide, Barry. Thanks. I thought it would be good just to tell you a little bit of Martin's and my incarnational story, and it was quite fun, actually, thinking back, looking at the photos. Look at my outfit, will you? The very long jacket over the very long skirt, but which was all part of the incarnational approach. So in 1996, Māori was working for Red Cross, and I was working in ESOL, and we felt a broader call to work with refugees. And there were lots of different refugee groups in New Zealand at that time, but it wasn't just, oh, we're going to be called to refugees. It was like we really felt like God wanted us to discern who exactly are we called to, because vastly different refugee groups and different needs. And so to cut a long story short, we felt called to Somali Muslims, and it wasn't on the basis that their food was better than any other group. And it wasn't actually on the basis that we had a particular interest in Somalis or East Africans over and above anywhere else. But what it was repeatedly, we heard story after story, that the Somalis were the most at-risk and vulnerable refugee group in New Zealand. And they were the group who was struggling the most to acclimatise, to adapt into the new culture. And so we hunted down a flat where we knew that Somali folks lived, and we started on the outskirts of the Somali community. We moved into a little block of flats called Britomart, where there were 6 Somali households. And during that time, I did adapt to wearing clothes that were appropriate. That was because there was at one point where I had some leggings on and a knee-length skirt, and I was told that I looked like a teenager. And that was not a good thing for a married woman. So at that point, I felt like I'd received the message loud and clear that I needed to become more culturally appropriate. But then Marty and I moved right into the hub of it all. And the photo at the top there is Arlington Flats. And we moved in there with 2 children, 1 child, and then had our second child there, and lived in a tiny little unit, and poured ourselves into working with Somalis. And on the screen, you can see that was our homework club, and it was really, really well attended. And we ran that every week and did, lots of learning support with them. And Marty did truckloads of football with the Somali men, and that totally went off as well. And he also was part of the Somali Association, and we did holidays and all sorts of things with them. And so, interestingly, one day we had a little kid knock on our door from downstairs who was a little Samoan boy. He said, "Excuse me, am I allowed to come to your house if I'm not African?" So on the one hand, that was probably a bit stink for him. But on the other hand, I felt like actually what had happened is we immersed ourselves so deeply in the East African communities, particularly the Somalis, but a little bit with the Ethiopians as well, but that we were known as people that only really hung out with Africans. And so that was 10 years of our life, and all of our children were born during that 10 years. And then when Max and Billy went to preschool, it was 1/3 African at Mount Cook Preschool. So we employed a bicultural worker. We went to Africa. We visited missional groups. Māori studied Islam, was part of the Somali Association. And we were also actually, there were a couple of kids that needed fostering, and we were approached, and they said, look, there's no one in our community that can do this. You guys are the nearest to our community of anybody outside of us. And so we were asked if we or any one of our contacts could foster these 2 children. We learnt a little bit of the language, and it did end a little bit tragically. We had a community worker who we were told by the community became a little bit threatened by the work that we were doing. And so he won an award for his contribution to the Somali community in Wellington. And we had to fold what we were doing because there was real suspicion around, that we were too involved and too sort of embedded in the community. But that was 10 or 11 years of our life. So what I would like us to do is to go into our breakout rooms, and on the bottom of page 1 of your little sheet for tonight, there's some questions that I thought would be good to discuss. What important features do these 3 stories have to help us understand incarnational ministry? Just anything interesting that you noticed. How is incarnation distinct from just living in the neighbourhood? Oh, I forgot to say also, when Marty and I worked with Somalis, we had no pork-related products in our house, and we had no alcohol in our house either, just because obviously that was important. How is incarnation distinct from just living in the neighbourhood? And then a quote from John Hayes, who suggests perhaps the heaviest cost of incarnational ministry is choosing to identify with only one people, one place. Discuss this quote in relation to the focus of your own ministry context. They're relatively big questions, but I think we'll need, how are we going for time? So it's 5 to 8. I wonder, we need to do at least probably 10 minutes, 12 minutes maybe on that. Yeah, we've probably got a bit of time. I wonder if we we might need 15 even. Should we try to do 15 minutes, and then it means we can all be heard and we can, get through all the questions. See you soon.
Scotty gone.
He was there a second ago.
This is me then, is it?
Oh no, do we want 3? Why don't we, can we have Jethro's crew just on their own? I think that makes sense.
Scotty already pre-do it.
We're not sure. Sorry, guys. This has been flicked to us. I think Scotty did the rooms, and then should we just try? St. Mary's and Michelle. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Sorry, guys. Oh, there we go. We're with Taita.
How did that happen?
We made you wait today. It's just like the suspense. So huge.
It was, but I'm glad that we've moved past that.
You having to sort out technology every time, so
We got over that hump.
Okay. So, any thoughts?
I can start
Go.
moving from kind of the more obvious to maybe a little more abstract, but I had, obviously they had to go. There was a cost. Then there was kind of a crunch point, a point once in the story where there was kind of, I've really got to decide if I want to stay. And then there was a sense, well, I picked up a thing where as as they went there, so they changed in the place rather than having it all sorted when they went. It was
No, that's good.
they grew as while they were there. So it was like by going, then their passion for what they were doing grew. It wasn't like they needed all that to happen before they went.
Yeah. Good. Anything else for question 1?
I guess it's all like, I mean, they're all stories of going to the margins, right? To the dark, like to kind of places where there is need. Yeah. So and maybe where it's you know what it's easier, well, in some senses easier to find Jesus, or like people more open to the gospel. Yeah, because when you're in poverty or you're a stranger in a foreign land, you're more vulnerable.
My parents went with OMF, and OMF was started by Hudson Taylor under like the China Inland Mission, and he was like one of the early, I guess there's been examples all through history, but he was like part of, I guess, the British missionary movement that took on that incarnational approach that said, that kind of separated out Jesus from colonialism and said, it's not about what you wear, it's about like Jesus. And so I guess I see, so he chose to dress and cut his hair like a Chinese person and live in more in central inland China rather than on the coast where most of the British or expats lived, and that kind of shaped the whole of that particular mission movement of saying actually it's about Jesus and it's not about converting people to like eating or living or wearing certain things. So I think about that as well. I think it's such an interesting dilemma, or not dilemma, but an interesting question of choosing to stay and die or choosing to get medication, and I don't know if it's a clear-cut answer of like what, of incarnational living, because there's like outcomes both ways,
Sure.
So but it's big sacrifice and suffering, that was a common theme of suffering, and that actually Jesus suffered, and I think you can see it through all of his, like most of his disciples as well. They all ended up having elements of suffering and walking in his footsteps, so sharing suffering, sharing in his glory.
I mean, to try and get into the heads of the other two characters, Father Damien and Hari, that sense of for the joy set before me, that preparedness to therefore endure whatever that cost is. I'm not sure that is kind of strongly apparent within our church today. I'm not sure, but within the Western Church today in particular. But,
it's not within culture, so therefore it has to be very strongly a counter, like a kind of alternative in the church. And yeah, I agree, it's not that strong.
Not that strong. What do we reckon about incarnation as distinct from living in the neighbourhood? I mean, that's not a particularly demanding question, but I think it's good for us just to try and tease that out a wee bit and thinking about, your context and our current context. We're not just living in our places, we are trying to be incarnational. So what are the characteristics that you guys would say that you have kind of adopted, imbibed, what you've adjusted in order to be living incarnationally?
Well, I would say I remember like the first year living in Taita and being like I remember we had conversations about it. I was like, guys, you can't bring chickpeas and legumes to like the community meal at church. It's just you need to make meat. Like we talked about, just because it did not vibe. So that was Anyway, that was an early memory.
We've been through exactly that one when we started working with men from prison. It was just like, you know, we cannot have chickpea curry. It has to be a big slab of meat.
Any curry.
And we joked that it's better to have a helping of Macca's than it is for someone to be smoking meth. And that became our little quote. Well, better to have Macca's than meth. So,
Macca's and meth. Oh, that's a good one.
Yes.
Anyway, that's like it sounds sort of a little bit trite, but it actually is kind of quite important. Yeah, it actually does. People notice those things when they, yeah, it can lead to.
so there is the whole thing of the difference between living in the neighbourhood, just living, and actually incarnating is that we are going to have to make some adjustments. Like there's no way you can't adjust. Our Somali one was pretty extreme, but we had to. They used to call us the infidels. That was just the name Somalis used to call white people.
It's pretty appropriate in Islam, yeah.
Yeah, and so it was just like, you know, someone would say, oh, look, I'm just going to head off and go and see the infidels. But what they didn't in English, they said it in their language. So we knew quickly, which is quite funny. But anyway, but yeah, so we're going to have to adjust.
I think one of the things that has also been a feature is we have found that having people over for meals, which was a key element of hospitality in previous season in Newtown, that actually didn't really necessarily work that well in Taita when you didn't, that was too, that church was actually an easier space because it was a more neutral space. And actually having somebody in your home in Taita was a big deal. Yeah. And so we had to adjust a little bit to that. Yeah. It was more once you got to know people, that was then fine, but not that first sort of, oh, just come round for a meal. That didn't sort of.
Yeah, totally.
Well, yeah.
And just, I think there's so much, that we can't know really what it feels like through their eyes. But I remember just people coming into our house and it just looked so different than their houses. When we were working with Somalis, we could not have a house. We lived in Arlington flats just like them, but our house still looked so different from theirs. Their curtains were always closed and was just so different. And coming into our house here, people would go, wow, your house is so big. And it's like, oh, it is. We used to have, about 6 children living here, but we don't now. And yeah, that's quite a thing.
Yeah. I mean, I back to your question though, I guess the difference between just living in the neighborhood and living incarnationally is there's an intention around it, but an intention that's followed by a practice, like an intention of like thinking through the implications or thinking through the cultural context of wherever you are, and then thinking through your practices as a result, or what does it look like to be present in that and constantly doing that. Yeah, so I mean it's there's quite a serious intention about it. Yeah. I would say,
Like, I mean, even us when we bought our house, we were like,
oh yeah,
it has to be within this area. It wasn't like, where's a nice house wherever we get. We were like, it has to be here within this range, within this area. It was a very small area. And
I was like, no, only these 4 blocks.
only these 2 streets.
Cultural, because everyone else is looking for their dream house with the big lawn, and you're kind of looking, and it's all about location and proximity to those that you connect with, which is beautiful. I wonder whether we've just got 4 minutes to go. Can we just jump on to the last one? Heaviest cost, choosing to identify with one people, one place. I'm just keen to know how your discernment has gone in terms of identifying, because Taita has a lot of diversity within it, even though obviously there is some homogeneity as well obviously. So what's your process there and how does that look?
Good
I
question.
don't think we have a process.
I think we've had yeah, I agree with you. I think we've had a call to like the people of Taita or Pomare as opposed to like there's a lot of foot traffic through Taita because of Walter Nash. So not really like we're really clear that that's not part of we're not interested really in connecting with people from outside the area, like in playgroup, like someday, but like trying to not make sure that nobody it's just people from the local sort of area. But
I think like just to like we didn't want to be a destination playgroup, so it was definitely not hyped up or made to be extremely exciting or anything. But the flip side is someone's brought their friend along who was really lonely and they lived on like a totally different part of the city, but they were connected to someone in Taita, and it's kind of interesting, like you can't be really hard line because God brings all kinds of people into your like journey, but most time and effort investment was into people who live here, right? Like,
yeah,
I think it's a really good question because the nature of Taita is changing with gentrification, and the number of young people moving here for their first home, that's on the rise, and so the census data here and the next census data will look quite different to the last one. And so what does that mean for us as a church?
Yeah.
As we answer this question.
Yeah,
For sure. Yep. And that's so been the journey of Nainai for us in the last 12 years. Because, I mean, one place, yes, we were called to Nainai. One place you guys have been called to Taita, but there is so not one people within.
No.
And I'm aware, while I wouldn't say we're doing a great job of reaching those on the margins in Nainai, but at least, we have a cohort of 30 people that connect either through the community centre or through Tumanako Ho or whatever. So that's great. But there's a whole other Nainai that we're not really reaching at all. And so it's that thing of, are we trying to reach middle Nainai maybe for our morning service, or do we just focus, what are we doing? And it is quite hard because you can't cater to everybody in your one space. And I'm curious, within Taita, how would you define that one people that you feel like you're called to? Do you know what I mean? Is there a particular, I don't like the word profile, that sounds terrible, but you know what I mean, the kinds of people that you might particularly feel called to?
I don't know that we have a clear answer on that.
It was illustrated quite interestingly just the other day because we had a Kurdish family over here for lunch, and we were chatting to them, and they've got some more family coming out, and I asked where they're going to live, and they said, we want them to live near us, and they said, but not in Taita. We don't want them to live in Taita. And so the interesting thing is they are on the margins in terms of they don't read or write, they don't speak English, blah, 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 and yet do you know what I mean? Like for you to reach some of the hood of Taita and them all in the one space wouldn't probably work. Close now. Okay.
Interesting perception.
but it will be.
Hi, everyone. So just wondering whether we have a little bit of time, keen to hear a bit of a report back from each breakout room. What sort of stuff has come up? We don't need to kind of report back everything that got said, but where did most of your conversation revolve around, and what were some interesting bits that have come out of that discussion? Shall we hear from Petoni first?
Sorry. Yeah, we talked a lot. We really only kind of got through the first two questions. And we only just started on the third one. But the first two, I suppose, just the fact that they went, and all the stories is they went and stayed. Like they went and they stayed, and there came a point where, with the first two stories, there came a point where there was perhaps choices that they could make to have an out, but they didn't, and obviously paid the cost for that. Yeah. Anything else that they did talk a lot?
Well, yeah, all of them had a strong sense of call in all stories, a real strong sense of God's calling to that particular group or area. And yeah, we just talked about that's the significance of choosing to be there and with the people for the people rather than for ourselves. And that being significant.
And willing to be in it for the long run, like not just after a couple of years of fruitful ministry calling it quits, but continuing through.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's us.
Bonnie, what about the other room? The one that wasn't us. So that's was that Jessie and Ben and Kat?
Yeah.
Well, 4 of you in that one. 4 different. Oh, it was a little
stacked room.
stacked room. Yeah, there we go.
Go, Jessie. You were brilliant.
I had so many thoughts on this. And I've temporarily lost them all.
Some of your friends from your stacked room.
How very convenient.
I mean, I thought that thought at the end, Jessie, was an interesting one, as that 15-second timer was going around Northland, that like your local context. That was
Yeah, I guess we kind of talked, we didn't really talk about, oh, well, we did talk about the examples a bit, but on that third question, I was just reflecting on how Northland is like a socially inept bunch of people, like they just don't connect at all, like not the church so much, they're lovely, but as a neighborhood, everyone is just in their own little world kind of thing. And we were talking about like how actually there's a real risk when you do incarnational ministry, you're hearing from God, and that's not actually a promise that what you do is going to be well received initially or at all by the people that you've gone to be with. That you may be very faithfully hearing what God is calling you to do and where to move, and still kind of have people turn around and be like kind of, like where it got to at the end of your time in Arlington as well, like just actually like, you got to get it, that you can't be here anymore, like we can't have you here, and just that risk as well. I kind of feel like maybe that's an easier risk than dying, which is seems to be the other option, but yeah.
Yep. Thanks, Jessie. Anything else from your room? Given there were so many of you, I think we're going to need to hear just that little bit more.
Well, I was just interested in rounding out that your wonderful story about Arlington, and a little maybe the postscript of I'm not sure if you'll get to that at some other point in this curriculum, but the postscript of that, that's 11 years, and that's some rich relationships in your children, your older children's first space of growing up and their memories. And I mean, I've lived there too, so I know like it was a beautiful dysfunctional place, but maybe just some of the things looking back that you've what you've learned from that, and what God was doing in amongst the kind of the pain and the carnage of having to leave at a time that probably felt premature when you were in amongst it.
It's a very painful ending. Interestingly, just, because it is nice when things are happy ever after. Wasn't quite that like that, but Max is still friends with one of the Ethiopian boys that we used to connect with. Billy spent time in Cairo with 2 of the Somali boys, one of whom is training to be an imam.
So we can claim that.
And just this weekend just gone, one man who has done 2 prison sentences since we worked with him, and I worked with him both times that he was in prison, but he rang Marty just the other day, and he rang him a month ago and then rang him just in the weekend. So it's nice to know that there are still those contacts, and when it hits the fan, there was still, you know, Marty was someone he wanted to connect with. So that was nice.
The unintended consequence, though, was that basically it became a discipleship movement that enabled folks to then be able to go off and eventually plant other churches. So, you know, whether that's Shannon, Featherston, kind of Castlecliff, yeah, here in Nainai. Yeah, anyway.
Anyway, any other, Kath, what are you thinking?
Oh, I was just really encouraged by Jesse's challenge to get us on the same page when we talk about incarnational ministry, and what it means. And I love what you said, Jesse. It's like a buzzword and that can be sort of thrown around, but are we all on the same page? Do we? Yeah, and so we had kind of a, I think that could go on for hours, that conversation. So there wasn't quite enough time to unpack that, but I loved that opening up of that. I really, yeah.
Anything from Haim and Michelle?
Yeah, for myself, I think I actually just have way more questions than anything else. Some of which include, and I know obviously there's like nuance to all the thoughts that that have been brought here, but things like, where was it? So the John Hayes quote, incarnational ministry is choosing to identify with only one people in one place. What does that mean when you're in a context which is highly multicultural, and where there are lots of different people groups that that you could be ministering to? You know, what does that kind of look like? Is you know, is it choosing to focus on one group? Is this quote kind of a bit more robust than that? And it's talking about, you know, by one people, it means, you know, people within a particular location. Yeah, so that was one question. I think the other thing actually, no, I'll leave it there for the moment. I had a bunch of other thoughts just swirling around, but yeah, that was just one of them. I think too, like, just to pick up on what like Jesse said near the end of our conversation, like Michelle and I both resonated with that, just that sense of like, what if you go to a place or you feel a sense of calling to go to a place and no one there wants you? Like, I just thinking about Northland in particular, I grew up there, so you know, I definitely remember the experience of being in a neighborhood which is deeply disconnected. And as a quick example, like when I was a teenager, there was this Māori family that lived across the road from us, where we were in a cul-de-sac, so you know, it was pretty hard to kind of just go past anyone. And I remember there were a couple of years that this whānau was living there where they tried really hard to organize street parties on the cul-de-sac, and just like the pickup was like, you know, just really, really hard. Like they happened a couple of times, but like it just yeah, it was just really, really, like you just got the sense that the wahine who was like at the forefront of trying to organize this thing and make it happen was just, you know, she was just struggling every step of the way with a neighborhood that was really disconnected from itself. So yeah, just really resonated with what Jesse was saying.
Shout out to Jesse. Lots of referring backs. Should we just hear something from Taita? What do you guys want to pull out that could be good for the group?
I didn't mention this in our like discussion, but I've been thinking about like the choices you make for your children about where you send them to school, where you send them to kindy, where you send them to daycare. And like in Taita, the only people that send their kids to Taita Central are either those that live nearby and intentionally choose to go there, or have cousins that go there. And as I'm doing my daughter's hair for the 3rd week in a row to get rid of nits, I'm thinking, like, I just find it so interesting around the choices you make that you can make for yourself, but what does it mean for your children as well? Not that nits is the worst thing that can happen, like death is obviously a much worse situation. But like your choices and the sacrifices you make as part of your family also have implications for your family. And so it's an interesting, like incarnational, both you're modeling a particular way of being for your children, but you're also like bringing them on that journey, and that has the joys and the sufferings as well. Yeah,
For sure.
Mm.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Like, obviously, yeah, the cost and having children. If it's any consolation, we had nits, I think, solidly for about 4 years straight. We never ever had all of our kids nit free. It was just terrible.
I'm not saying that obviously nits are a general primary school experience, but some are more prevalent.
Okay, just if you didn't get right through the questions and you feel like there's a bit more juice in the orange, we're not going to stay on those any longer. But I do think there's there's some good follow-up conversations there. And, things like Hamish has raised, what about multicultural context? What about contexts where you're not wanted? How do we navigate this? It was just interesting. I was just telling our little group in Taita there that we have some neighbours who've come in as refugees and they've got family arriving, and they said, we want them to live near us and we really don't want them to live in Taita. So, just the whole fact of being on the margins in a particular neighbourhood or in New Zealand doesn't mean that you necessarily connect with other people on the margins. And in fact, being a Kurdish refugee family and being, a kid from the mongrel mob, just because they're all in Taita, like, it's not necessarily easy to hold all of that, or even possible, I would say, to hold those different needs within the one kind of kaupapa. Anyway, so do feel free in your groups to just take it further. And I guess if you feel like you don't quite know who your people are, the reality is we cannot do it all. We cannot reach everyone in our neighbourhood, and it is about discerning. It doesn't mean that everyone necessarily has to be exactly the same, but I think, within Nainai, there are very different groups of people, and we're most certainly not reaching them all. So that discernment around, God, where are you calling us within this location that we're in? Do you want to just flick over the page? I just thought it would be good to have a bit of a table so that we can look at we're talking about incarnation, what are the strengths and what are the pitfalls? And recognizing that, because there is a danger, obviously, that this can become the kind of, the zenith of Christian ministry. It's incarnational, but recognizing there are some real pitfalls and some things, to consider. So, I don't know, should we just have someone, do we want to just read them aloud? Is that a good idea? Do you want to just read them for us? Just read across that way.
Just one at a time. It's the model of Jesus. Here, Philippians 2 and John 1:14. So we follow in Jesus' footsteps with a pitfall of dogmatism, legalism, pride, sacrifice for the sake of it.
Yep, I reckon just whiz through, because it's probably not all new for people, but I just think it's important to name.
It's a practical way to reach the neighbourhood. We become insiders.
That 1 Corinthians passage, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but it's, sort of, when I'm with the Jews, I become as a Jew, and when I'm so-and-so, and so Paul says that whoever he's with, he becomes like them, so that some might be saved. I think that's actually a really strong incarnational text. It might be good, that could be one to look at in your groups and just get familiar with it, but it's very much that thing of Paul being willing to make adjustments in his life in order to be like the people that he's working with, in order that they will be saved. So that is something that we need to weigh up. To what degree do we become like them? Yeah, sorry.
Mm.
And the pitfall?
We can lose our distinctive identity and saltiness in an effort to identify, and perhaps the risk of over contextualizing.
One example of that, there was a movement, well, I'm sure it still exists, but where when we started working with Muslims, there was a whole big movement of people becoming like they'd go to the mosque and they would do everything like a Muslim. They'd do Ramadan, and they were, what did they call themselves? Was it Messianic Muslims or something? There was some sort of term where it was very, very extreme on the contextualized spectrum. But then we actually spoke to some people quite some years later, and it was like, nah, that didn't work, because they'd kind of lost the distinctiveness, and it was all about, the goal was all about actually appearing Muslim and finding God within Islam. And you know, another example, I guess, would be we've had people who have been in gangs, and they've said, I've got to come out of the gang to follow Jesus. And then they've said, oh, look, I reckon I can do both. I'm going to sort of do Jesus, or I'm going to do some sort of transformation within the gang. And people have then come back and said it didn't really work. So that issue of just thinking about how much can we be in amongst, and where do we have to draw a line? And there's obviously no rules around that, is there? It's something you've got to discern. Yeah.
Sends a message of costly love. We're deeply committed to a small geographic place, and we fall in love with our particular neighbourhood. We don't come in as the experts, but as humble learners, we become known and therefore seen as humans. And a pitfall is that we can develop maybe a messiah complex. We can start to take ourselves too seriously. We may not be living in a sustainable way. We may, because of the cost, become more wedded to results.
I think that's probably quite an important piece, that where you pay a high price, it's kind of like, we've done so much, then I'll do whatever it takes to get the results. So I think that is one that's worth giving some consideration to. Just what the high cost can do to our soul, and then where it can feed into our vulnerability and neediness. Yeah.
Next one, it is focused. We go deep where we are, and we let the place hold sway over how we invest our lives. Pitfalls that we can lose ourselves. Our identity becomes too wedded or welded with the ministry. And it's a spiritual discipline, because we live authentically, and in amongst, we're changed. And downside can be, we can start to worship the lifestyle as an end in itself and become self-absorbed.
So obviously those pitfalls are quite extreme, but I think probably two of the ones that are important, maybe three: the over-contextualizing, are we at risk of losing Jesus? I've paid a high price, so I've got to have the results. And it's so focused, and we're so focused on this people, that we kind of lose who we are and kind of almost have to become a different person. And I think that's an interesting one. And also obviously how we raise children, those that have children. So, you know, anyway, I wonder whether we break into groups again. And some of you might have already talked about, so the reflection questions there talks about careful adjustments with regards to incarnational ministry. What kind of adjustments do you think are needed for your context, and why? But then an important question around these pitfalls: how much of myself do I lose in incarnational ministry, and what do I retain? How do I stay authentic to my true self? How do I discern this? Because we were having a chat with Scotty about this the other day, and there is a bit of an idol culturally around authenticity. Who is my true self, and being true to myself? So how do we reconcile that with incarnational ministry? So Marty's going to really quickly just pop you back into your breakout rooms. You might have time to make yourselves a cup of tea while that's happening, or do some spiritual warfare. I think so, yeah. How long are we doing it for? It was 15 minutes ago. get in? Did you need to put join in all of them?
Adjustment. It's like adjusting from your current situation in order to be more effective.
Yeah, I think that's how I'd interpret it. Yeah.
I would have thought about it as like there's certain like behavioral, cultural things that you bring in that sometimes can separate you out, and then you have to actively choose to change. I think there's in some ways you're always going to be you're a product of your own upbringing and your own family as well, aren't you? So some stuff you kind of keep, and some stuff you adjust.
I mean, I think on some of that stuff though, you are a product. I mean, I think this was years ago actually, where we had a conversation maybe as a team with you guys. It really stayed with me for a long time around, we actually, like, in the end, all we have to offer people is Jesus, right? Like, I mean, and we are different from the neighborhood. That is like, you can't really get away from that, and you have to. I mean, it's probably you just have to live into that and be conscious of it. Doesn't mean you don't adjust your ways of doing things, like, because I do think you have to, like, it would be problematic sending your child to Upper Hutt to school, right? If we were trying to, in terms of like living in the context of Taita, like that's a bit problematic from an incarnational perspective. Although there maybe are other reasons for doing that. So it's not that you don't make some of those decisions, but you don't kind of bring with you the stuff from where you're from, but it's just you own that, and you kind of walk in the world, the two worlds that you live in.
There's an issue. We can't see ourselves through the lens of those that we work amongst. And so, you're right, we can only bring Jesus and we bring ourselves, but obviously, and the Somali example was really extreme. Like, I absolutely had to wear long skirts, otherwise they wouldn't listen to a word that I said. If we drank alcohol, it would have been absolutely write them off, but they did respect us, and I think the lifestyle changes that we made were important. Apparently, we were told once that people got together and they said, Martin and Alison are really great. The only problem with them is that they're not Muslim, but they live better Islam than we do. And so it was this weird thing. They sort of were really faithful to it all. And but I mean, I'm just sort of thinking, so they were in a sense some quite superficial changes, but it's just, I still think often that, there is this discernment about God. What of me can I keep? Obviously we keep Jesus, but still even how we do Jesus is going to look different with a different population, isn't it? That how you might share Jesus with a Muslim is going to be really different to how you share Jesus with somebody else. And so it's kind of that thing of how we embody the gospel and live the gospel is going to look different depending on who we are amongst. So yeah.
I go back to the property one as well. Like, I mean, I think we're kind of interestingly trying to live a countercultural, like, Christian lifestyle too. So we aren't exactly living exactly like people who live here, but like, exactly the neighborhood, but we're also not. I think one of the things we've noted is that actually it's being here for a long time and people getting to know you. And so saying, well, we're not buying this house to then sell it and then buy a nicer house in in Kelson or Harbourview or wherever. We're buying this house and we're going to the local school and we're walking in the space, we're being in the space, over a longish period of time. But it's quite a challenge to think about what to change or what to. There's so many counter pressures, isn't there?
Maybe I think a bit more practically, if you think about the people that you are connecting with, which is young families, right? It's in the school context.
And Kindy.
Yeah. So part of their contextualization, or is a degree of like, maybe you're not going to have a birthday party for your kids that you might expect in a middle class neighborhood. Like, I mean, I'm just like, you know, like it's there's not, I don't know, 20 party favors with packs all to go home, or do you know, like, I don't know, you think about it a little bit like that, or you think about it in terms of some of those different activities, I guess, that you're like sending, I don't know, Eva's involved in the local violin thing because that's what's offered for the local area and for the local kids at the school. I mean, it's probably a bit unusual still, violin, but it's like, it is, you know, for the local area. So,
Well,
you know,
that one's ended, you know. Anyway,
What's it?
yeah.
Hanoi strings.
They just missed out on a grant, and so they're having to like stop the one that's happening in Taita, but it's still happening in Pomari, so, and in Nainai, so yeah.
Yeah, the title was the first one.
Yeah, they missed out on the like Creative New Zealand grant, which apparently they've got 5 out of the last 7 years, but yeah.
I think that question that you asked at the start's a really good one though, Alison, is, you know, filtering everything through how do the people that we're reaching see this, as opposed to automatically just filtering it through our lens straight away as to what we think is the thing, is actually filtering it through, well, how will this, what's the, you know, we might have our ideas and they might be great, but it's you know, putting it through the, you know, in church, you know, church is an example. It would, you know, the service is an example of that, right? It's what is it that people want, not what is it that we think people need, you know. So I mean, I just like that the way that you framed it up is a good question to ask about what we do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite extreme when you see the 1 Corinthians passage. He says, to those under the law, I become like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law. You know, like, I'm sure some discernment had to happen for that. You know what I mean? In terms of, you know, it's not just because I do think culturally things are by far weighted around, I just need to be true to myself. You know, you do you, I'm going to do me. And so being true to ourselves is a phrase I think that's used a lot, and yet we can still be true to ourselves, but some of the kind of shop front does need to look different. But I think we have to be careful because we can fall into those pitfalls. And like Anna said, you know, when you've got your kids and you're sort of raising them in a, you know, way, I mean, I think it's very delicate spiritual work that we do around this, of working out what's a blockage for them to receive the gospel and what doesn't matter. And we just don't necessarily know, do we, what's a blockage and what doesn't matter. But I hate to think, you know, over the years for us, what's actually blocked people from wanting to follow Jesus.
And yet a small kind of gesture in the scheme of things can be quite significant in terms of just, yeah, the sense of open door that might have been closed.
Yes. I wonder whether it's nearly 9:15. So I wonder whether we jump back on and just wind up, because I don't like being that person that takes things longer than they're meant to be. So let's go back.
Yeah, a couple more seconds.
It's that awkward moment, eh? Don't want to start a sentence because it's going to get cut off, but
Oops, where are they? What happened there?